Hello and welcome to this channel. Esoteric Christianity is one of those subjects that seem tailor-made to generate misunderstandings and enmities. For an Orthodox Christian, this whole business just reeks of sulfur and usually will have a very strong opinion on the subject without deigning to research it. An esotericist, on the other hand, will be convinced that the ordinary Christians have rocked themselves into dogmatic slumber or are being kept in that state by their ignorant and misguided clergy. A sincere Christian faced with the possibility of an esoteric knowledge will tend to keep his guard up and the holy water ready, in case he may find himself in a chase with some lurking little devil. That might not be the best of attitudes to study a subject. An esotericist is already convinced that the simple Christian does not understand the depth of his religion, and so the esotericist will not have a real incentive to lower himself to study an exoteric doctrine. After all, if he is already in possession of the esoteric or profound meaning, what sense is there to waste time on exoteric stuff, that is, for lesser men? I am myself a Catholic exotericist in the sense that I take to be true the official dogmas of the Catholic Church that are open to anybody to study and accept or reject without no restriction. I hold to a belief that my church expects from its scholars as well as from illiterate peasants. None of the truth that I profess is hidden in any way or reserved to an elite. I don't believe in a Christian esotericism at the heart of the gospel for the same reason that I'm not a Protestant. I don't think that there are teachings that an ignorant clergy, either well-intentioned or not, is holding back from the masses, be they esoteric or Protestant teachings. I don't believe that there's a hidden spiritual church distinct from the visible hierarchical church, like the so-called esoteric Church of John as opposed to the official Church of Peter, as esotericists will have it, or like the cross-denominational hidden spiritual church of the evangelical Protestants. And finally, I'm not impressed by rosy crosses, either that on Martin Luther's sigil or that of the mythical Rosicrucian Brotherhood a century later. As a reactionary, I'm opposed both to the Protestant Revolution and to the so-called Rosicrucian Enlightenment. But that is not the whole picture. As much as I'm opposed to these, the fact remains that the Rosicrucian Enlightenment had its roots partially in the Renaissance Platonism of Georgios Gemissos Platon, Cardinal Nicolaus Cusanus, Cardinal Bessarion, the Florentine Academy of Marsilio Ficino and his friends, Pico della Mirandola and others. And I'm definitely interested in these. The Byzantine Platon came to Italy during the Council of Florence in 1438-39, and it was his presence and influence that gave the final push to the rebirth of Platonism in the Latin West. His disciple, the Greek Orthodox Bishop Bessarion, later Cardinal of the Catholic Church, was a learned Platonist himself, bringing important manuscripts to the West and defending Plato from the Aristotelians. Nicolaus Cusanus is working on the vast corpus of writings that try to synthesize Platonism and Christianity. Around 1450, the Florentine Academy opens and Ficino is busy translating the entire Platonic corpus in Latin. But he also translates the Corpus Hermeticum and Plotinus. Pico is anxious to harmonize Christianity with the Kabbalah and other wisdom teachings. Why is this relevant? Because in the Rosicrucian writings of the early 17th century, we find out that the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross looks back on the mythical Christian Rosenkreuz as the founding figure. According to the Rosicrucian legend, this character walked the earth between 1378 and 1484. He lived for 106 years and was active precisely in the period that I just described. That may not be a coincidence. What this tells me is that Johann Valentin André and his merry men were looking back to this period as a point of reference. In any case, whoever looks back on the history of recent Western occultism with its pretenses of esoteric knowledge will stare in the face of half-digested, decomposing Renaissance Platonism. Whatever secret teachings modern esotericists think to possess, they were already openly discussed and debated within Platonic circles without any secrecy from the time of the Platonic school of Chartres in the 11th century onward. Only somebody who ignores the history of Platonism in the Latin West can fall for the trap of modern esotericism. I have two important reasons to roll my eyes every time somebody brings up a secret Christianity hidden from the profane, like my good self. One of these is that the secret in question is usually an insult to Christianity. The second is that more often than not it is also an insult on Plato and his disciples as well. And I consider myself to be both a Christian and a Platonist. Let's take as an example the idea that the various religions are as many pathways to the same goal. The image used often is that of a mountain with many paths that lead to the same top. This comes originally from a perfectly respectable concept within the Platonic tradition from the late antiquity. The idea behind it is that there is an essential unity and a natural diversity to being, and as a particular application you will see the various spiritual traditions as pointing in the same direction. In this context, the doctrine of the founder of the Academy is nothing more than an incarnation of an older, indeed timeless, wisdom that goes back to Zoroaster, the Chaldeans, the Egyptians, and so forth. This is why Plotinus joined the ill-fated military campaign of the Emperor Gordianus against the Persians, hoping to meet Oriental sages after having previously studied with a Neo-Pythagorean Ammoniosakkas in Alexandria. This is why in the late antiquity Orientals well versed in their respective traditions, like Malkos, better known as Porphyry, or Iamblikos, became Platonists. But this concept has one meaning in its original context and a very different one when it is taken out and thrown into our contemporary relativism. Nowadays, to say that all paths lead to the same goal is nothing more than an easy excuse to cobble together an artificial concoction to wrap up one's own ego in exotic veils. But behind those colorful veils, the ego remains just as obese and shapeless. Meanwhile, since the main function of this concept for the contemporary so-called spiritual but not religious is to keep him in his comfortable self-sufficiency, he will never have to confront in any serious manner the consequences of it. There is a very simple way to recognize somebody who professes this teaching in a thoughtful way and somebody who just uses it as a support for his own comfort. The former will analyze the different traditions to see if they are regular ones and can qualify as being among those that lead to the summit or not. The latter will just treat any spiritual tradition or religion the same way, picking and choosing for himself whatever suits his personal taste. The first one sees the unifying divine intellect behind the multiplicity of manifestations. The second searches for the reflection of his own ego in everything that comes in contact with it. Ironically, to take what is relative as the absolute is the very definition of ignorance, or avidya, according to Patanjali in his Yoga Sutra. That's the Sadhanapada, the 5th sutra. What were the Platonists of old thinking about when they tried to unify the different traditions known to them under the aegis of Platonism? They were thinking about pagan cults, that is, cults of gods of the land, that is, pagus. These are, by definition, local cults that can be unified under the aegis of a universalist ideology, like that of emperor worship, for instance. Hence the symbiosis between local pagan priesthoods, Platonic philosophers, and the political might of the Roman emperors against rival universalist cults like Christianity. This political infrastructure of oppression was later taken over by the Christianized emperors to persecute the pagans, the heretics, or the Orthodox when the emperor was persuaded by some heretic. Be that as it may, what is important for our subject is that the Platonists of late antiquity, especially after Porphyry and Iamblikos, gathered around their philosophy the religions that they knew, that is to say, the cults of various local gods. That is the origin of the idea that at the core of various spiritual traditions there is one lofty doctrine, and that lofty doctrine in question is a form of Platonism. A revelation like Christianity or Islam does not fit in such a scheme, because these are not cults of local gods, but universalist religions. A Roman who honors Mercurius may look eastwards to Greece and identify Hermes as one and the same as his god. Then he can look southwards and identify the Egyptian Thoth with the same Roman divinity. To the north we will find Odin of the Germanic tribes that corresponds to his Mercurius. And a bit westwards from Germania there's Lugh of the Celts. All these gods are the divinities of given local tribes or nations, and all of them were identified by the Romans with their Mercurius. Their worship defines a nation and a local culture. These are pagan divinities in the proper sense. The god of the Christians doesn't fit here. Christianity is either a dangerous deviation from the pagan norm, or something much more that goes beyond it. In antiquity, some adopted the first position and rejected God in favor of the gods, or they chose the second position and became Christians. But there's no middle ground. But in modern times, the idea of a Christian esotericism has been taken up by some very capable people who can't be just dismissed easily. With the advent of the traditionalist movement started by René Guénon, the discussion has been raised to a whole new level. In the following, I want to take up some of the ideas on Christianity of Fridtjof Schuon, a disciple of Guénon. What I want to point out is that by putting the Christian tradition in a greater symphony of regular spiritual paths, perennialists end up distorting the basic concept of this religion. Schuon is the author of a book with a telling title, The Transcendent Unity of Religions. And since he is well known to the English-speaking perennialists, I think he is the best suited for a critique. Christianity as it is does not fit in the place assigned to it by perennialists, so it is put on a kind of Procrustean bed and remodeled to fit. The main subject that I want to take up is that of the fall, because if we want to understand the solution that Christianity comes with, we have to have a clear idea of the problem. Schuon reinterprets the doctrine of the fall and of sin to present a Christianity compatible with what he takes to be perennial tradition. So I will present Schuon's idea of the fall, and I will trace its lineage back to Plato and Hesiod and to the myth of the fall from the Golden Age. Then I'll take up the biblical picture of the fall from Eden, and I will show that these two are not one and the same. And since they are not one and the same, undoing one fall is not the same as undoing the other. So let's see what Schuon is saying. Quote, he assumes with the cross the evil of existence. To be able to assume this evil, it was necessary that God should become existence. The cross is everywhere because creation is necessarily separated from God. End quote. This is from page 161 of his book, The Fullness of God, that deals specifically with the Christian tradition. A little later on, he identifies existence with manifestation. What he is saying is that the cross is an answer to the very existence of the world distinguishable from God. If that is the case, then the evil of existence is something indeed necessary, as he says. This makes something like the fall unavoidable. Already at this point we can see that the biblical and Christian view of covenant relationship with God is substituted with an ontological unification with God, as we can see right from the first page of his book. Quote, if we start from the incontestable idea that the essence of all religions is the truth of the absolute, with its human consequences, mystical as well as social, the question may be asked how the Christian religion satisfies this definition, for its central content seems to be not God as such, but Christ. That is, not so much the nature of the divine being as its human manifestation. Thus a patristic voice aptly proclaimed, God became man, that man might become God. This is the Christian way of saying that Brahma is real, the world is appearance. No, it isn't. The patristic doctrine of deification of man is not about a supposed unity between the Creator and his creation. That may well be the case at the metaphysical level, but that is not what Christianity deals with. No orthodox theologian will agree with this association between Christianity and Hindu Vedanta. The Church Fathers deal with a deification by grace, not according to nature. But of course an esotericist can always claim that he understands the Christian position better than informed Christians do, and this is what makes esotericism so dangerous. It is unassailable by its very nature, and esotericists can always afford in good conscience to ignore what they consider exoteric or dogmatic Christianity, since they are convinced that they are already in possession of a higher truth. As for me, this is what I find to be the most annoying about esotericists. More often than not, you can't have a proper conversation with them because they are more than ready to dismiss so-called dogmatic Christianity while feeling no responsibility to inform themselves on what they are rejecting. Actually, it is not that they reject so-called exoteric dogma, they just reinterpret it to the point of deforming it. And if you don't agree with them, you ignore the so-called deeper meaning of your own tradition. Here's an example of this reinterpretation from Schuon. In his essay Delineation of Original Sin from the same book, that's page 55 and following, Schuon wishes to expand the Christian concept of sin as an act to that of being. Quote, if we wish to give the word sin its broadest or deepest meaning, we would say that it expresses above all an attitude of the heart, hence a being and not simply a doing or not doing. In this case, the biblical myth symbolizes a substance and not simply an accident. Thus, original sin for the Hindus is nescience, avidya, ignorance that Brahma is real, the world is illusory, and that the soul is no other than Brahma. All actions or attitudes contrary to intrinsic and vocational law, dharma, result from this blindness of heart. That's from pages 56 and 57 respectively. It is perfectly true that in Catholic Christianity sin is an act and not a being. Well, Luther went on to consider the mere inclination to sin that defines our fallen nature as being part of sin, but this was rejected by Catholic dogmatics. However, we Catholics are supposed to ignore the dogma and practice of our Church as it is proclaimed and promoted by the magisterium and take Schuon as our magisterium, otherwise we, supposedly, don't understand the broadest or deepest meaning of the doctrines that we profess. Does it occur to esotericists that, at least in some cases, explaining the doctrine of a given tradition through the teachings of a different spiritual tradition, as Schuon does here when he appeals to Hinduism, may lead to distortions instead of clarifications? And instead of gaining a deeper meaning, we simply get a different meaning. Just a thought. In any case, if the problem of sin has to do with our acts as opposed to our being, then the problem to be solved is our relationship to God, that is, the relationship of us taken as a complete whole in distinction from God, to whom we are joined through a covenant relationship. But if sin has to do with our very being, then sin affects our nature first and foremost, as Schuon points out. Quote, "The fall was precisely the rupture between reason and intellect, the ego and the self." That's on page 59. This is Platonism, pure and simple, not Christianity. In fact, he says later on, "From the point of view of the Platonists, in the widest sense, the return to God is inherent in the fact of existence. Our being itself offers the way of return, for that being is divine in its nature, otherwise it would be nothing. That is why we must return, passing through the strata of our ontological reality, all the way to the pure substance, which is one. It is thus that we become perfectly ourselves. Man realizes what he knows. A full comprehension, in the light of the Absolute, of relativity dissolves it and leads back to the Absolute." Here again there is no irreducible antagonism between Greeks and Christians. If the intervention of Christ can become necessary, it is not because deliverance is something other than a return, through the strata of our own being, to our own self, but because the function of Christ is to render such a return possible. That's from page 65. I agree with Schuon that there is no reducible antagonism between Greeks and Christians, but that is not because they say in different ways the same thing. That is because they talk about different things and offer solutions to different problems. What he gives us here is the Platonic problem with the Platonic solution, so I can't agree with him when he presents us with the following image later on. If to speak symbolically, all men are in danger of drowning as a consequence of the fall of Adam, the Christian saves himself by grasping the pole held out to him by Christ, which no one else can hold out, whereas the Platonist saves himself by swimming. But neither course weakens or neutralizes the effectiveness of the other. On the one hand, there are certainly men who do not know how to swim or who are prevented from doing so, but on the other hand, swimming is undeniably among the possibilities open to man. The whole thing is to know what counts most in a situation, whether individual or collective. That's on page 72. Indeed, neither course weakens or neutralizes the effectiveness of the other, but that is because they are two courses to two different goals. Schuon keeps on giving us a good idea of what Platonism is and how well it relates to something like classical Hinduism, but he has yet to say something meaningful about Christianity. In any case, the picture that he offers is clear. Dogmatic Christianity, supposedly, is the exoteric covering for the exoteric core that is supposedly Platonic in nature. See for instance this sentence at page 61. The fact that each was right on a certain plane or in a particular spiritual dimension resulted in each emerging as a victor in its own way, Christianity by imposing itself on the whole Western world and Hellenism by surviving in the very heart of Christianity and conferring on Christian intellectuality an indelible imprint. Or this sentence at the following page regarding the doctrine of creation. Quote, "The Christian polemicists did not understand that the outlook of the Greek sages was no more than an esoteric complement of the biblical notion of creation." They didn't they? As a matter of fact, nor does the present Christian polemicist. What is important, though, is that Schuon correctly identifies the Platonic roots of the so-called esoteric Christianity. This has nothing to do with the apostolic tradition, but is something that Christianity took up in its process of acculturation into the Greco-Roman world. What I find really startling is that Schuon agrees with Guénon that Christianity was at its origin an esoteric doctrine and an initiatory group. According to these two authors, faced with the world of late antiquity, Christianity turned from an esoteric reality into an exoteric organization to save the dying West. So let's put the pieces of the puzzle together. Supposedly, Christianity was originally an esoteric reality as a counterpart of exoteric Jewish law. Then it spread into the Greco-Roman world, became exoteric, and in the same time took in, as an esoteric core, Platonism. I ask the listener to press the pause button now and let that sink in for a minute. I mean, as a Christian I have nothing against believing strange things, but this exceeds even my capacity to believe. If the late antiquity already had Platonism as a doctrine that could function as a vivifying esotericism, why was Christianity needed in the first place? If Christianity was esoteric at its origin, why was there a need for Platonism as an esoteric core later on? Am I missing something here? So where is this all coming from? What is the point of Platonism? Now I'm going to survey the Platonic doctrine of the fall from the original perfection, and I'll trace the mythical origins of this teaching to Hesiod. And after that I'm going to contrast it with what the Bible says about the fall, and that way it will become clearer what they are after. The most memorable image of the fall in Plato is probably that given by the character Aristophanes in the Symposio. According to his story, that I will simplify here, humans were spherical in the beginning and they had 4 hands and 4 legs. But Zeus decided to counter their haughtiness by cutting them in two. Hence the separation of the sexes and erotic love as a desire to regain the original completeness. But in Greek mythology, the first woman was Pandora, and in the Golden Age, humans just grew out of the soil. So what Plato talks about here is the fall from the Golden Age. What Hesiod illustrates as the giving of the first woman, Plato illustrates as a separation according to the sexes in the primordial human. In fact, the end of the Golden Age brought with it not only the separation of the sexes, but also that of the seasons. Before, there was a perpetual spring. Pandora herself was a gift from Zeus to mankind as a punishment for the transgression of Prometheus. What happened was this: humans and gods came together for a feast and a sacrifice. This means that in those times, since they shared altar and table, they were kin. But Prometheus separated the share of the two parties, one for the gods and one for man. The gods received the strong bones that are not eatable, while the humans received the eatable flesh. This separation of the table portions implies the separation of the two kindred. Henceforth, gods and men were to go their separate ways. Flesh is what sustains mortal life in the body. The bones represent what is durable. According to the Greek heroic custom, the body of the warrior was cremated slowly to preserve the bones that were kept afterwards in an urn as a perpetual memento. So the bones that here go to the gods are a witness to their perpetual life. In short, it is this Promethean division that confirms the gods as immortals and humans as mortals, separating them. In the Greek civic religion, sacrifices were the only source of meat, and on great civic occasions the flesh was distributed according to social rank. So the civic sacrifices and meat consumption were about conforming men in their mortal state in front of the immortal gods, and about confirming social distinctions within the body politic. After the Golden Age, men were to live in hierarchical societies, separated from the gods, and were to reproduce sexually. This is what the Delphic expression "know thyself" was about originally. Apollo was reminding mortal men who were coming to his temple that they are indeed mortal, and they have to give the due deference to the immortal god who dwells therein. To use a perennialist term, this is Greek exoteric religion. Against this, you have the Orphic opposition and then the Pythagorean and Platonic synthesis. Orphics rejected the bloody sacrifices and meat consumption. In the context of the civic religion, this is a rejection of the social order of the polis, but it is also a rejection of the very sacrifices and practices that separate the immortal or divine nature from the mortal or the human nature. So vegetarianism and antisocial behavior was linked to an aim to overcome one's mortality and to regain the kinship with the gods. I'll not go more into this topic here because it is quite complex. The final goal was to regain the Golden Age, but through the intermediate Age of Heroes, which in turn is the Golden Age of our current Iron Age. I'll not complicate this further now. What is important for us here is that this is the esoteric counterpart of the exoteric civic religion. They logically depend on each other. The Pythagoreans tried to reach a synthesis of these two for a political reformation, but because of their political involvement, they were defeated and persecuted. Later, Plato took up the bloody banner. Hence Plato's twin aims of founding a good political order and to help humans to reach back to divine nature. Politics and divinization, both through education or paideia. This is, by the way, the very heart and soul of our classical culture. Notice that in the Golden Age we were the immortal god's kin, and based on this kinship by nature we can claim immortality. That is what the Orphic initiate claims before Persephone. Platonism uses the mathematical sciences by which we get to know the cosmos as instruments of purification and deification. In other words, the mathematical sciences, and after them dialectic, are supposed to accomplish for us and in us what the mysteries accomplish for the initiate. So the practice of philosophy is a kind of religious initiation that leads to immortality, and we can entertain this hope because our higher faculties are godlike. We need to cleanse our intellect from the influence of the lower faculties of the soul so that we can ascend to the unifying divine intellect. This is something that we accomplish by our own effort on the basis of our nature, or as Schwann says, this is what we can accomplish by swimming ourselves. Now let's see the biblical story of Eden. God creates Adam from the dust and puts him in the Garden of Eden. But Adam is alone, and his creator says that it is not good that a man should be alone. That's Genesis 2 verse 18. This is a clear allusion to the creation narrative in the first chapter, where after each creation day we are being told that God saw that it was good. So Adam by himself is not accomplished. This state is not right. In the end, God takes Eve out of Adam's side, and that is how we have the first couple. This is how the original situation of "it is not good" is overcome. This is the episode in the biblical narrative that corresponds to the separation of the sexes. But while this separation has to do with the fall from the Golden Age in Hesiod and Plato, here it is anything but. Adam and Eve are not thrown out of Eden just because Eve was taken out of Adam's side. Just like Pandora, whose very name, as well as Hesiod's story, shows her as being a gift from the gods, Eve is a gift to Adam from God. But Pandora is a deceiving gift, meant to punish under the guise of beauty. Not so Eve. She is genuinely a gift, made by a well-meaning God. These are clearly two interpretations of the same reality. For us Christians, the separation of the sexes is a good thing. For esotericists, the same separation of the sexes is to be overcome in the hermetic rebis, the androgynous primordial human nature. That is what alchemy is about, as any informed hermeticist will agree. So what is the event that provokes the loss of Edenic happiness? It is a resetting of the relationship of Adam and Eve with God. It is a consequence of a change in attitude on the part of the couple towards their creator. It was not about their nature, but about an avoidable decision. They used to trust God, and under temptation they ceased to trust him. They ceased to be faithful to their Lord. That is the original sin, and that is why the way back to God is through faith in the sense of faithfulness. When the Old Testament prophet is cited repeatedly in the New Testament to the effect that the righteous shall live by his faith, we see from the context that he is talking about continuous faithfulness and not just simple belief. This is so because it is what Adam and Eve were supposed to do in their situation, and all this has to do with a covenant relationship that was broken, not a kinship by nature that was obscured. A covenant is what unites in the bond of kinship two parties that are not related by blood. The classical example is that of marriage covenant. Another example might be that of so-called cross-brotherhoods, as we call them in my culture. Two or more men will bound themselves together by an oath-swearing ceremony and will become brothers, though they are not related by blood. This was a favorite practice among Romanian outlaws, who would thus create a parallel society outside the bounds of official society, but just as strict and binding, in fact, even more strict and binding. The good standing and honor of an outlaw in front of his cross-brothers depended on his covenant faithfulness to them. You can't unswear an oath, so breaking it can lead to only one solution: death. A covenant is for life. No ifs, no buts. So original sin is a breaking of a covenant relationship and has to do with one standing before God. I gave the example of a covenant brotherhood, but in the case of Christianity we have a covenant fatherhood. God is our father, not because of our nature. He already has a son and heir by nature, but we can become sons and co-heirs with Christ through grace. Not by nature, mind you, but by grace. That is because our relationship with God is covenantal. Consequently, we are dealing here with two very different concepts of evil. In the Platonic case, we have the formal principle and the material principle that are, by necessity, complementary. You cannot manifest the world from the formal principle without the material principle. You can't eliminate evil from the world because it is right there at its foundation as one of its principles. Think of the yin-yang symbol of the Chinese tradition. Day and night, man and woman, odd numbers and even numbers, the one and the dyad. These are complementary, and the world comes forth from their interaction. You can't even talk in this context of evil as we understand it. Could anyone say in good faith that night, woman, and even numbers are evil? Of course not. The fall from the Golden Age was necessary because only that way history could commence, just as the manifestation of the world out of the first principle is necessary for the existence of the world. In fact, the flow of history reflects the descent along the world axis from the formal principle, the Platonic one or good, to the material principle, the indefinite dyad. When the Platonist swims, to use Schwann's image, what he does is to go back along the world axis toward the first principle, where everything rests in eternal unity. That's why the alchemist has to realize the rebis, the androgynous human nature, before the separation of the sexes. Christianity has nothing to do with that. The pole that Christ holds out to the believer, to use again Schwann's image, will not lead you back to that unity, because separation like that of the sexes is not regarded as evil in the Bible narrative, as something to be overcome. It is just taken for granted. Christianity starts with a differentiated world, takes it as something good, and is preoccupied by a corruption that seeped into it after the differentiation. It is this corruption that is not natural to the world that Christianity seeks to heal. If I were to say in Platonic terms what Christianity is about, I would say that it is about healing the link between the divine idea or archetype and its sensible manifestation, not about reabsorbing the sensible manifestation into its archetype. The breaking of the covenant relationship with God by man severed our link to our Creator also. He is our Father and sovereign by covenant, but also our Creator. So when we turned our back on Him, that had an effect on our nature as well. That is the origin of the corruption that eats away our nature. We have to get back into a proper covenant relationship with our Lord to be able to stand before the source of our nature. Our salvation has both a juridical and an ontological dimension: justification, sanctification, and finally, in the age to come, glorification. All by grace, not by nature.